All right, welcome everybody to Farm Employment Laws Made Simple. Glad you could make it. Welcome to those who are listening to the recording as well. My name is Ben Zoba. I'm the beginning farmer educator here at New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, and we're happy to be hosting this workshop alongside the good folks at Farm Commons, who you'll meet shortly. Just by way of attendance, we I use the Zoom attendance log to know who to send follow-up resources to. We're going to be able to send the recording and some slides to folks. So if your Zoom name is at all different than your real name or the name you registered with, feel free to change your name in Zoom. You can go to the participants button at the bottom, and then you'll see this three dots thing pop up when you hover over your name, and you can click rename, and then we'll have that accurate. Otherwise, my associate Sydney might ping you just to get your name, but she's also going to be popping links into the chat as well. So that's Sydney, our great helper. Feel free to put your name and farm organization and where you're located in the chat. Sometimes it's fun for folks to see who's close to them. Maybe you'll make some friends. Um, and the mute button you're probably all familiar with now and having done Zoom meetings plenty. And yeah, I think that's all I need to cover for this slide. The plan for the day, I'm just doing a real brief intro here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Chloe Johnson, who will speak for about an hour about exploring H2A. And then Rachel Armstrong will be joining around 7 to talk about employment law basics. At New Entry, our mission basically is to train the next generation of farmers, and we have various program areas by which we try to do that. I live in the farmer training team. My main responsibility is to teach our online courses and host workshops like this. We also have a food hub, a food aggregator. So if anyone's in the Massachusetts area and is interested in selling to our food hub, feel free. We also are taking CSA memberships now. I'll mention that in a moment. And then if you're in a farmer training organization anywhere around the country, my coworker Colleen coordinates this field network of different incubator farm and apprenticeship programs all around the country. And we try to share best practices with each other and help each other work together in the work of training the next generation of farmers. So that may interest you. This is funded by a grant, and when you log off, you will get a survey. I think it's about 9 questions, and they're all, most of them, multiple choice, pretty quick. It would be a great help to us if you would just take the time when you log off of Zoom. That'll pop right up. If you could fill that out, it helps us know how to improve these workshops and report back to our funders as well. Also, the last couple questions are about takeaways from the workshop, and if you do put something in there, your likelihood of doing it increases when you write it down. So it might be a good way to help you be accountable to your goals. So this is part 5 in a 6-part series. All the previous parts, some of you may have attended these. They are all recorded. Sydney is actually working on making them compiled with all the various slideshows and supplemental resources. So we'll post that to everybody who's registered. So eventually you'll have access to all this content. But here we are today. And then in about a month, this date, 3/18, might actually be shifting. One of the presenters has a conflict. So I think it's going to be 3/25. But next month, we're going to be talking about building a positive workplace culture. If that topic interests you, we'll be sending around the registration link shortly. A few upcoming events. I did want to highlight the Legal Food Hub has a winter webinar series that's actually been ongoing. I mentioned it the last version of this workshop series, but they have a farm property insurance workshop tomorrow, 12 to 1 p.m. Sydney just put the link to register in the chat if that interests you. I know Farm Commons, our presenters today collaborate a lot with Legal Food Hub. Actually, I think it's one of your associates, Chloe, who's giving that talk tomorrow.
Oh, it might be, yes.
Yeah, I think Jeanette is doing it.
Perfect.
Yeah. And then I mentioned our CSA is open if folks are interested in getting a CSA share from New Entry. And then in about a month, we'll have part 6 of this workshop series. We want to thank our funder, NERMI, Northeast Risk Management Education, for enabling this workshop series. I think folks have gotten a lot out of the presentation so far, and I think they'll get a lot out of this one too. So yeah, without further ado, I want to hand it over to Chloe Johnson, who is an attorney on staff with Farm Commons. She's going to give a little introductory slide to tell you a little bit about herself. But Chloe, thank you so much for making the time and joining.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for joining. So today I'm going to start today's program with talking about the H-2A visa program, legal obligations for people who might be interested in using that program or taking advantage of the program, but also some ethical considerations for farmers who might not yet be familiar with the program and entering it and how you can do so ethically. But first, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about Farm Commons. You may or may not be familiar with us yet. So I want to give you a little bit of introduction to our organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is here on the screen, which is to empower agricultural communities to address their own legal vulnerabilities within what we call an ecosystem of support. And that ecosystem is made up of us, other farmers, other ag service providers, and we all collaborate to help come up with solutions to legal issues that farmers face. Farm Commons' role is mostly developing and delivering educational programming, like today's program. We are always doing research, and we're really striving to develop plain language educational programming, which can be webinar format, written format, long form guides, checklists, model documents, all of these things. We're hoping to make them really accessible to the farmer audience. And we also believe we do a fair amount of leadership development because we truly believe that the solutions for legal challenges that farmers and ranchers face come from, or best to come from, the community of farmers and ranchers themselves. So we see our role as presenting information that can only assist people in making their own critical decisions about how to form and run and sustain their businesses over time. Now, we focus on farm business law, but that in itself is a huge area. We have a very particular focus on employment law, which you'll hear about today, but we also do work around business formation. So developing an LLC, we do work around land access, which would be leases or purchasing land or cooperative land ownership, uh, all kinds of insurance, food safety insurance, crop insurance, property insurance, um, and uh, also diversification and issues like zoning. So all of these things that are can be really paperwork based and can be somewhat boring, but do, once they're all put together, really help create resilient businesses. Those are the legal issues that we at Farm Commons focus on. And we are a membership organization. So we have producer members and we have members who we call institutional members or other ag service providers, other farmer educators. I will have a coupon code for anyone who is interested in trying out the membership program at a discounted rate. And I'll give that to you at the end of the program. And Rachel will likely uh, also give it to you when she's done speaking. Now, we don't at Farm Commons, or very rarely do we take legal cases. So we aren't making money by representing farmers or having clients. The vast majority of our funding comes from either our membership program or more likely grants, either federal grants or private foundation money. We're really hyper focused on this educational piece. And I'm Chloe Johnson. I am the staff attorney here at Farm Commons. We're a very small team. I'm the only full-time attorney staff. We have other attorneys on staff, but I really am a lot in the background doing a lot of the research and writing and forming the basis for a lot of the work we do. I personally live in North Carolina. Now, Farm Commons serves farmers and ranchers across the U.S. It was formed and is based in Duluth, Minnesota. But I'm the Southeast contingent. I live in the Piedmont of North Carolina on the unceded territory from the Occaneechi and Eno peoples in a small town north of Durham, which some of you may be familiar with. And I have a history of, my professional history. I've done a lot of different things. I've worked on a lot of diversified vegetable farms in Georgia, where I'm from, and in North Carolina. I have practiced as an attorney for farmers here in the area where I live now. I've also been a litigator, and I'm bringing all of that together, my experience on farms and my experience with the law together in my role here at Farm Commons. All right, so let's get into the material. So just so you have an idea about where we're going today, we're going to start with the purpose of the H-2A program, what the rules are meant to do. Then we'll get into the legal obligations of farmers and ranchers who are wanting to use the H-2A program, what they might have to do in order to be able to do that. And then we're going to go talk about ethical considerations, and to give you insight into that, there is a risk of human trafficking in the H-2A program, and we want to be upfront about that and talk to you all about how you can mitigate those risks when you participate in the program. And we hopefully will have time for questions at the end, and my colleague Rachel Armstrong should be joining us about 10 till the hour, and can also help answer some of those questions. And one thing I'm not doing today is giving legal advice, right? We're here to give general information about the H-2A program to help you decide if it might be a good fit for your farm. Anything specific about how to fill out a form or some specific situation on your farm and how the H-2A program might apply to that, I likely will not be able to answer because that might stray into the territory of legal advice. Just a little disclaimer. Okay, so we're going to start with the purpose of this program. The H-2A visa program is designed to bring temporary non-immigrant workers who are lawfully admitted to the U.S. to perform temporary or seasonal agricultural labor or services for farmers. These workers' visas are only approved if the employer, the farm employer, has demonstrated that they cannot find sufficient, willing, and qualified U.S. workers to perform the jobs. So the rules make it very clear that they don't want the program to displace U.S. workers. And so that's why you will hear a lot about how you have to demonstrate that you have sought out and cannot hire domestic workers or people from the U.S. Now, the H-2A visa program is one of several types of visas that allow foreign nationals to work in the U.S. So there's an H-2B visa, which would be a lot of food service as it falls under an H-2B visa. So meat packers or food processing would likely fall under that visa. There's also H-1B visas, which you may have heard of, which are for temporary academic and research positions. And like technological companies like Amazon or Microsoft might use H-1B visas. So there's a variety of different types, but for workers who are going to work on farms, we're going to look at the H-2A visa program. And you want to keep the purpose of this program in mind, as it's going to offer some justification as to why there's going to be so much paperwork about proving there aren't sufficient domestic workers, and then why there's so many rules about length of stay and other aspects of the worker's experience. I think the average length of stay for an H-2A visa worker is about 5, 6 months. And I think 10 months is the maximum amount that they can come during a year. So all of this might be sounding familiar to you. You might be here interested in the H-2A visa program because you may be having a difficult time recruiting or sustaining your workforce. Your operation might be really hand intensive and therefore very labor intensive, and you're looking for a sustainable labor solution. And that's what we're going to help out with today. You're going to get some introductory information to understand if this is an opportunity you want to explore. But before we get into really leveraging this opportunity, we do want to start with some simple truths about the H-2A program. And we're starting here because if there are misconceptions about the program, we want to try to clear those up front. And some of them might be a little difficult to swallow, but we're not trying to hide them. We want to just address them head on. So first off, the H-2A visa program is just a type of visa. It doesn't do a lot of work that you might assume it would do. So the H-2A is the name of a visa that allows an individual from another country to be eligible to work in the United States. It is not a program that recruits or supplies workers to farm operations. So separately and really at the same time as the business owner is working through the process of getting the visa, that farm business owner also needs an additional strategy to find individuals in a foreign country who are qualified and willing to do the work on their farm. And then on top of that, the farm operator also needs a strategy to get the worker to the United States, to the farm to work. And we're going to talk more about this, but farmers use a variety of means to find workers. You may have personal connections in a foreign country where you can source some labor. You could work through an industry association that has networks or connections or know as other farms who have used workers from a certain country. And there are also individuals or businesses that provide these services. And we're going to talk about those a lot. Also, consulates might be a good resource for connecting you to workers. Okay, so the first step in knowing that about this program is knowing that applying for the visa is just one step in what can be quite a long process. And farmers are going to be responsible for a lot of the other steps as well. Okay, secondly, the H-2A program is not cheap. Now, this is changing slightly. You all may have heard at the end of the last year, the Trump administration changed up the H-2A rule a little bit and did lower H-2A worker, essentially the minimum wage for H-2A workers quite drastically. So the cost, essentially the minimum wage that you have to pay H-2A workers may be coming down. And we're going to look at that more closely so you can get a sense of what those changes in the minimum wage are for H-2A workers. But even though the cost of H-2A labor may be going down, it still doesn't mean that the program is cheap because there are a lot of requirements for you to provide the H-2A workers who come to your farm. In general, and even with the new rule, farm business labor costs are going to rise when you start using the H-2A program. The H-2A program, remember, is not designed to provide a solution to a shortage of is designed, excuse me, to provide a solution to the shortage of domestic workers, but it's not designed to help manage the cost of labor for agricultural employers, because there are a lot of regulatory expenses that are a part of the H-2A program. The minimum wages for H-2A workers are called the adverse effect wage rate, or AEWR, and those are going to be generally higher than the minimum wage of a state for other farm workers. You do have to pay for transportation expenses from the worker's home country to your farm and housing. You have to provide housing for your H-2A workers as well. Though the new rule does allow a small adjustment to the hourly wage of workers for that housing, it's still not going to cover the entire cost of you providing housing, especially if it's housing that you own. Okay, and at the same time, that knowing the H-2A program is not necessarily cheap or a cost-saving measure, many farms are quite okay with the higher labor costs because without labor, crops and livestock are never going to get to market at all. And so a lot of farms find that the program works really well for them if they can do the initial setup well. Okay, we're going to get into all of that, but first, the final truth or simple fact about the H-2A program that we want to talk about up front, and that is that human trafficking is real. The new rule from October does nothing to change this fact. There have been some worker protections that have been essentially rescinded in the last year as well. So the H-2A program has always created tremendous vulnerability in the people who get the visas and come to work in the US. I mean, it creates a lot of opportunity, but there is also this underbelly of risk. It's indisputable to say that the H-2A visa program as a whole, not in every case, but as a whole, is a significant avenue for human trafficking in the US. There are violations of regulations requiring fair and safe worker housing. That's really common. And importantly, farmers themselves often do not realize that the workers on their farm are being bought and sold or forced into slavery or having their wages stolen or receiving housing and work opportunities that are different than what they were promised in their job orders and job contracts. And we're going to talk about how that's possible in a little bit. Just to give you an idea, since 2017, over 9 federal lawsuits in North Carolina alone have been filed that allege abuse of the H-2A program. And that includes underpayment, confiscating passports, forcing people to pay transportation costs, even though the farm is supposed to pay those, or threatening deportation if people flee once being subjected to all this mistreatment. And then in Georgia, there was in 2021, so this is a little bit ago now, but there was a big operation called Operation Blooming Onion. My Southern accent just came out. That resulted in the indictment of 24 individuals that were trafficking people through the H-2A program all throughout South Georgia farms. And that included threatening people with guns, not paying them, and withholding their documents. So these are just some examples to bring home the fact that this does happen. But we know the vast majority of farmers are ethical employers and would never stand for this type of thing happening on their operation. So we're going to talk about ways to detect and stop this from happening on your farm. And do know that it's very possible to use the H-2A program and be a highly ethical employer in a situation where the jobs make your workers' lives better and the jobs also make your farm operate more efficiently. So when it works, it really works. Okay, so those are the basics and we've got them out of the way. And now we're going to get into some legal obligations or the steps involved in getting yourself into the H-2A program so you can assess if that is something you want to do. And when we zoom out and look at the official process of applying for the H-2A program, you could say, well, it's relatively simple. You could boil it down to 3 steps the 3 steps you see here on the slide. It'd be step 1, you submit a temporary labor certification application to the U.S. Department of Labor. And then once the Department of Labor approves that, you move on to step 2 and you go to a different agency, the U.S. Customs and Immigration Services. You submit this I-129 form to them. And then that gets approved. And once that's approved, the workers apply for their visa through the consulate in their country and admission to the United States. And then they can come to your farm and work. So we can put it that simply, but putting it that simply is a little bit of a misnomer, a little deceiving. It's like saying filing farm taxes is really easy. It's just step one, fill out a Schedule F. Step two, complete your Form 1040. And step three, put it in the mail and mail it to the IRS, right? That's not an untrue description of how to file farm taxes. But for anyone who has ever gone through that process, they could tell you that taking those three steps depends on at least a week's worth of work. And the success in completing those forms depends on one's tolerance for reading complex rules and confusing instructions. And then in the first case, having maintained excellent and detailed documentation of your transactions over the previous year, right? So it is a lot more complicated than those three steps, and that's true of the H-2A program as well. Completing these forms here requires many hours of work, and your success is going to depend on following detailed and maybe sometimes confusing instructions. And before you even start filling out the forms, you do have to have all your ducks in a row. You have to have job descriptions that are accurate to what folks would actually be doing. You have to have housing arrangements, your pay schedules, and more before you begin. We're going to go through all the obligations so you'll see them. And really, the forms are like a quiz, right? If you give the right answers, you're going to get approved. If you don't give the right answers, you won't get approved. So you are going to need to be prepared for this process. And like I said earlier, we're not going through how exactly to fill out these forms in this webinar, but we are going to talk about what you need to have in place before you start completing the forms. And know that a lot of farmers do work with an attorney or another H-2A support service to help them fill out the forms and work through this process. But we're going to start with now the things you have to have in place before you really get to the form part of the process. Okay, so, and you can see this is one of 3 slides. So there's a lot of information we're about to go through. And all of these really do list significant expenses that the farm has to take on or provide in order to utilize the H-2A program. And this isn't even a complete list. There are or may be additional obligations, not necessarily, depending on your specific operation. And it's also a summary. So we're not getting into the nuances of all of these, and we're not outlining all the contingencies, but this will give you a good idea of what you'll have to have in place in order to participate in the H-2A program. First and foremost, this can be the biggest barrier for folks getting into the H-2A program. Employers must provide free housing to all H-2A employees. At this point, I'm going to put free in quotes because you can adjust the hourly wage downward by a certain state-specific amount based on that new rule at the end of 2025. So it's not quite free anymore, but technically it is. You do have to provide free housing and have that ready for your H-2A workers when they come. This housing also must be inspected and certified by all relevant regulatory authorities, which includes federal and usually state or local certifications for residential housing. So the housing has to live up to the standards of residential housing in your area. So that can limit the flexibility in what type of housing you can provide. And under OSHA, providing farm worker housing is what's called a temporary labor camp. So you're also going to need to meet the obligations of the temporary labor camp under OSHA's regulations. And Farm Commons does have a guide called the Farmer's Guide to In-Kind Wages that goes through the responsibilities of providing farm worker housing. You can go through these responsibilities a little more in detail. Secondly, employers must provide free daily transportation from the employer provided housing to the work sites, if those two things are different. So they won't always be different. If there's a mobile home on the farm site, H2A workers can walk to work. But if you rent, say you rent housing uh, down the street from the farm, you're going to be responsible for providing transportation to the farm site or the work site. And in the same vein, employers are going to need to provide safe, insured transportation at least once a week to a shopping destination that can meet a variety of needs, like a Walmart, where they can get both groceries or food and have access to medicine. Um, that's why a Walmart would work well, or a larger shopping center with multiple shops. Okay, and this ties in with housing and also that weekly shopping trip. This next obligation, employers must provide free and convenient access to a kitchen and cooking facilities for meal preparation. Or, so this is a choice you have, you can choose instead to provide 3 meals a day at a cost to the worker. However, the amount that you can charge a worker for those 3 meals is capped at a pretty low amount. As you see now, it is $16.28 a day. That amount is going to be adjusted in March, so you would need to check with the Department of Labor. It will likely go up, but I don't know by how much. It's not going to go up significantly, or I doubt it will go up significantly. Um, so this is a choice, right? You could provide the kitchen and cooking facilities, and that has to include things like pots and pans, dishes, silverware, everything that someone would need to be able to cook and eat for themselves. And this is how this dovetails with that last obligation to provide the weekly trip to a shopping center. If you have a kitchen facilities, but you don't have access to groceries, they're not very helpful. The choice that you make, the 3 meals a day and how much will be deducted for that, or the kitchen and cooking facilities, the one that you choose must be stated in the job offer. So that's a contract you have with the workers, and you have to state a lot of very specific information, and it has to match with what happens when they come to the farm. So you have to choose early on and put that in the job offer. Employers must cover the cost of travel, food, and lodging from the home country to the place of employment, so to the farm, along with the return trip of the worker. And the employer has to pay all the visa fees needed for the H-2A employee to work in the US. So that's a lot of obligations. And still, this program is quite useful for many farms, even with all of these expenses. I have one more slide to go on the legal obligations, but I do want to pause here to recognize that these are a lot of obligations that aren't owed to domestic workers or workers from the US. And that's because workers who live in the US are in a very different situation. Generally, H-2A workers haven't been to this country before, except maybe if they have previous experience with the H-2A program. They are not able to be licensed drivers in the US. They're not familiar with the cities and towns. They may not speak the language. They aren't familiar with shopping stores. And they're going to need support in connecting with these resources that are necessary to live. And in these ways, these workers are extremely vulnerable, and the law recognizes that. That's why they have employers provide so much support and structure for the workers' stays. Okay, this is the last of the 3 slides of the legal obligations. We are almost there. So the rule states that employers must pay H-2A employees the greater of what we talked about earlier, the adverse effect wage rate, or the AEWR, the prevailing wage, and or the state or local minimum wage. So typically the AEWR is going to be higher than the state or local minimum wage. Again, that is changing for some states, and we'll look at some changes in the next slide. But these things do change annually. So the AEWR for 2026 was set by the rule published at the end of last year. It will change for 2027, so you do have to stay on top of those changes. Also, and this is very important, domestic workers you hire cannot be paid less than the wage paid to H-2A workers. So when you hire H-2A workers, typically, yes, the wage for all of your employees will rise. Again, I'm in the Southeast, so that's very much going to happen in the Southeast because our minimum wage rates here are typically still the $7.25 an hour. So you do have to look at that requirement when you're calculating your total payroll costs at minimum wage rates. So if you have H-2A workers and domestic workers who are doing comparable work, they have to be paid the same rate and the higher of the two rates. All right. Also, employers must carry workers' compensation insurance for their H-2A workers. And of course, workers' compensation premiums are going to vary depending on the nature of the work and the injury risk level and your state. So I can't give you an estimate of how much that will cost, but workers' compensation can be a good investment anyways. If you don't already have workers' compensation, you can check out our Farmer's Guide to Hiring Obligations, which explains how and why workers' compensation benefits farm owners. Mostly because once you're participating in the workers' compensation program, employees are not able to sue you to get any medical bills paid based on an injury at work. They have to go through the workers' compensation program. So it can be of benefit both to workers and employers. That Farmer's Guide to Hiring Obligation also has some tips on how to manage premium costs, which of course can be helpful. Okay, and finally, employers must provide H-2A employees with a work contract outlining their total hours for the season and wages. And in that contract, you'll say you estimate how many number of hours the person will work for the season. And you are obligated to pay these H-2A workers at least 75% of the total wages promised, even if work is no longer needed. Now, this is because the H-2A worker is in a different position, again, compared to the domestic worker. Excuse me, at least theoretically, a domestic worker, if laid off, say, in the middle of the season, could go get another job at Walmart, Starbucks, or somewhere else. Again, that's theoretical. I know the job market is hard now. But the H-2A worker just cannot do this. They would have to travel back to their home country to get another job and then potentially come back or wait until the next season. And that is going to cost them valuable time and money. They are not legally allowed to work anywhere other than what's in their job order. So you do have to keep that in mind. If there is a risk of the season ending earlier, you are going to be obligated to pay your H-2A workers for 75% of their contract. All right. Let's take a look at what is happening with the wage rates for H-2A workers. So not only did the AEWR get dropped, be reduced in every state, at least once you account for the housing adjustment as well. But it also got split into two tiers or skill levels. You may hear it be called a skill level. So workers can now be classified as either skill level 1 or tier 1, which is less skill and therefore a lower wage, or tier 2, skill level 2, which is a higher wage. It's estimated that most, like 90% of H-2A workers who come into the country this year will be paid that level 1, skill level 1, the lower wage. But we'll see what happens and what farm business owners decide. So I have two states here, California and North Carolina. Just to give you an idea, California and North Carolina are pretty vastly different in how we handle minimum wages. So at the top, I have the AEWR for 2025. So what it was up until October 2nd of last year. So taking California as a test case, in 2025, an H-2A worker there was only one rate and it was 19.94 an hour. In 2026, California H-2A workers will be paid either 18.71 an hour or 16.45 an hour, depending on the skill level they're assigned. But on top of that, business owners are allowed to adjust their hourly rate by $3 an hour, further reducing that hourly rate. And that would have, so in California, a tier 1 worker with the housing adjustment would only be making $13.90 an hour. Now, that takes them below the California minimum wage. California does not exempt farm workers from their minimum wage. So a farm business owner in California would have to go above the AEWR and pay their H-2A workers the $16.90 an hour, which is the higher minimum wage, the state minimum wage. So you can't go below that. So if you're in a state that does have a relatively high minimum wage and doesn't exempt farm workers, you will have to pay the H-2A worker at that rate. For comparison, North Carolina's minimum wage, like I said earlier, is only $7.25 an hour, so it doesn't come into the calculation here. The AEWR is much higher than that. In 2025, an H-2A worker in North Carolina made $16.16 an hour, and in 2026, they will likely make $11.11 an hour. So that is the tier 1 or skill level 1 with the housing adjustment also deducted. And that would be what they would make an hour. And you can see there's going to be California is a pretty unique test case, but there is going to be a large difference between that state-based housing adjustment that can be deducted from the hourly wage. And do know as well that either you or anyone working on your behalf are allowed to collect fees like the job application fee or service fees as any way to recover a lot of those costs that you have to cover for your H-2A workers, like their transportation costs from their country or their visa fees. We did, as we said, you can charge limited fees for food if you provide the 3 meals a day. And then there are also some allowances, low monetary amounts, but there are some allowances to charge for daily travel if you do have to provide that transportation to and from the housing. Okay, to bring this back to how we use the program and fill out those forms, you're demonstrating by completing those forms that you understand all of these obligations and you are ready to provide all of these things and that you have secured them. You're really attesting that you are ready to participate in the H-2A program and you understand what that means. And again, many farmers find that these costs are comfortable. Many other farmers just aren't able to secure these things. And, success in the H-2A program really often depends on having access to resources. Some farmers are going to be in areas where there is plenty of suitable, affordable housing nearby, so they can rent something in a nearby community. Maybe there's also a big box store near the housing. And it's all pretty convenient. But other farmers are going to be in more rural areas, far from affordable housing, and they're not going to have the means, opportunity to build their own housing on the farm to support the program. And there's just some communities with better transportation options or ride services that make the daily or weekly shops and transportation possible. But some farmers have what they need to provide all of this themselves. So it really is dependent on one's circumstances, whether or not the program is going to work or how quickly you can start using the program. Okay, we're going to take a little pause here. We've gone through the basic character of the program and the basic legal obligations. And so we're kind of at a checkpoint. If you are able, or if you are already experiencing difficulty securing domestic workers for your positions on your farm, and you think that temporary work from people from other countries could fill that gap, then you've taken step one, you've checked off step one. That is a reason that this program might work well for you. And then the second thing, if you are in a position to meet those obligations and fulfill those needs for the H-2A workers, then this program might be a solution for you. And we're going to continue exploring deeper either way, but it's helpful to take a little assessment to see where you're at. Okay, so I gave you a little window into this earlier, but one big question is when I'm getting started, how do I find workers? And farmers have traditionally turned to industry associations. So like a association of tree fruit growers, if you're a fruit grower. Um, Many associations are going to have networks that are able to connect their members to resources that assist with H-2A programs, not only finding and recruiting workers, but may also be able to help connect you with attorneys or other professionals who can help you complete the paperwork. It's very helpful to know other farmers who have used the program to get information. Now, folks are also able to turn to what are called H2A labor contractors or H2A LCs, or they're also called farm labor contractors or FLCs to recruit workers. So these are businesses who provide, of course, for a fee, recruitment services. And they may also provide assistance with paperwork, regulatory obligations, and communication with candidates. Increasingly, FLCs are taking on additional parts of worker administration, like payment of wages, making travel arrangements, paying tickets for workers. Some are even hiring workers themselves and leasing those workers to farm operations. They may even handle things like housing, meals, kitchen equipment, and of course, farmers. The more an FLC or a labor contractor does for the farm, the more the farm will pay for those services. But this is also where things can go wrong. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, I did already mention this, but I want to make sure I really hone in on how all of this may affect domestic workers if you also have domestic workers on your labor force. There are several obligations built into the H-2A program that are designed to ensure that the H-2A program does not degrade opportunities for domestic workers. The program, again, only exists to fill in where the domestic labor supply is not satisfying a need. So as part of the visa application process, you're going to be required to do several things to continue recruiting domestic workers. Positions need to be filed with specific state agencies, advertised with those agencies to make sure that they are listed locally, and you have to follow specific standards in the way that you advertise. And then you can advertise, but you're also obligated to hire any qualified, eligible U.S. worker who applies for the job. So that's anyone with the required degree or the required experience, however you fashion your job description. And then again, U.S. workers must be hired at the same hourly wage and with the same benefits like workers' compensation as are provided to the H-2A workers. You do not have to provide housing for domestic workers, though. And if workers are laid off, if the season ends early, H-2A workers have to be laid off first. You do have to keep on the domestic workers longer. And that is true even though you do have to pay the H-2A workers at least 75% of their contract. Bear in mind, the rules can change as they did in October. And this program is really highly used. There is a lot of pressure for things to become on both sides. There's more pressure for things to become more friendly and easier for farmers to use. There's pressure to make the program safer for the workers coming from other countries. So things will continue to change. So if you're using the program, make sure you're paying attention to what those changes are. Okay. We do want to make sure that you understand how you could mitigate the risk of human trafficking. And first, I want to connect on a shared definition of trafficking so we all understand what we're talking about. When a person is exploited, or the definition that we use is when a person is exploited for another's financial gain through the threat of force, coercion, or fraud. Trafficking deprives someone of their ability to make their basic life choices about where they want to live, what they want to do for work. It denies them their fundamental freedoms. All right, so that's the definition we're going to use, and I want to tell you a story. This is a true story based on a farm in Wisconsin and some things that happened with some H-2A visa holders there. And it really illustrates how things can start off well, degrade, and how farmers may not be aware of what's happening, especially when they're working with farm labor contractors. So Santana is an alias, it's not the person's real name, but as I said, the story is. And Santana was from Honduras, and in Honduras, he was struggling to earn enough money to make ends meet, but he meets someone one day who says, I can get you a good job in the US on a farm. And Santana is interested, but he's a little concerned because he does have a health condition. It's in his back, it's very serious, and he can't just bend over all day. So he's like, I'm not sure I can do farm work. But he's relieved to hear that this opportunity is fruit harvesting, so he wouldn't have to be bending over. So he continues to develop a relationship with this contractor in Honduras. Eventually, Santana is given a written contract. The contractor helps him book his travel to the US. He shows him how to open a bank account in the US. And then Santana gets to the US and he feels like he's set up and everything's going to go well. So the farm and the farm owners seem fine. They don't speak Santana's native language, so the contractor and the colleagues have to help translate when he interacts with the farmers. But things are going okay. Initially, Santana is sending most of what he's making back to his family so they can build a house in Honduras. But then after a few months, the work starts to change. Suddenly, and this was not in his contract, he is assigned to stoop to weed cabbages. So Santana complains. He says, this isn't what I signed up for. I have health concerns. This is really going to aggravate my back. And the contractor is no longer friendly, starts ignoring him, tells him, just get back to work. Santana threatens to quit, but then the contractor's tune really starts changing and says, you're going to be seized by the authorities if you quit. You'll get thrown into detention. And all of that, especially now, may be true. So Santana is quite scared, and he continues to do the work, even though it's damaging his body and the pain starts to become unbearable. And Santana doesn't know how to get to a doctor. He doesn't have money or insurance either way, and he doesn't know what to do at this point. So again, he tells the contractor he needs to quit. And again is told that quitting isn't an option. And then Santana persists and says, I need a ticket back home. I'm just going to leave. But the contractor doesn't allow him to leave. Instead, he threatens him, implying that he'll have someone back in Honduras set fire to his grandmother's house. So he starts threatening his family as well. So Santana, afraid, unsure of what to do, keeps working. But then he starts talking with his coworkers, like maybe we can go find other work somewhere here together until we can get back home. Unfortunately, the contractor catches wind of this and sees Santana as the ringleader and then demands a quarter of his paycheck in response to this organizing, and again threatens his family back home. So Santana says, I'm just going to try to get back myself. He looks for his papers, but realizes the contractor still has his visa. Um, so he's hurting. He's being extorted. He can't stop working, but the work is hurting him. He doesn't have his paperwork, so he can't travel back home legally. And he's afraid that if he does anything about it, his family is going to be hurt. So in this situation, the farmer every day would come to the field and didn't know anything was going wrong. He smiles at everyone, he gives instructions. Again, those are translated, and the workers get to work. The farmer thinks these guys have free housing, they have decent pay, they have a ride to town every week. What could possibly be wrong? And this is how, as a farmer, this forced or coerced labor could occur right under your nose. Really kind and moral people can get caught up in this. But there are ways to reduce the risk, and you probably see a very easy one, which would be not to give over, or to give over as little power as you can if you work with a farm labor contractor. So the best thing you could do likely would not to use a farm labor contractor at all, which would require you to do the recruiting of workers yourself, or through an association, or through the consulate, um, and also develop these contacts necessary with communities that may want to work under the H-2A visa. So that's pretty high bar, but many farmers do this. And as you can see in the story of Santana, bad things happened because this farmer had given up a lot of control to the farm labor contractor. Wage theft and assault are not legal, nor is restricting the free movement of another adult or seizing immigration papers. But these things do happen all the time in the H-2A program. And it happens because these are people who are unfamiliar with and unable to access our courts or protect their rights in our country. So again, the next thing you can do is never give control for payment, especially, or housing to farm labor contractors. If you can handle that yourself, that is going to protect your workers to a great degree. The more power you give to a farm labor contractor, you're increasing the chances that that power will be abused. Now, this is true especially if you don't speak the native language of the workers, or all the workers that are working on your farm, because in that case, you're going to be dependent on the honesty and integrity of the people who do. So really making sure everything is going well often requires learning the workers' language to recruit effectively and ensure they're being paid honestly. So if you can do these things, you are significantly reducing the risk of human trafficking. And that brings us to the end of what I have for you today. Oh, it is almost 7. And I'm sure, again, Rachel will share this with you as well, but we do have a coupon code if anyone is interested in becoming a producer member of Farm Commons. Write this code down. It says it's already expired. That is not true. I will we'll make sure that coupon code is still good for you. And yeah, let's take some questions if there are any. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm not sure if Rachel is here yet. Yes, she is. So I saw some things coming in on the chat, but I wasn't able to stop and glance at them. So are there questions, Ben?
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you, Chloe. I think the one I saw got answered. So, Lorian, if you have one, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chloe, for this like really great presentation. But I was wondering about I was asking about state specific rules for H-2A, but you answered that actually in some of the things you were talking about. But I'm wondering about farm labor contractors and how common it is that they cater to small farms rather than big farms. And also, I know that, I'm in Maryland. So I'm like, I know there are farm labor contractors that are on the eastern part of the state but there really aren't very many operating in my area, Montgomery County, Maryland. And I'm sort of wondering if you, in your travels, heard about ones that cater to small farms, or
Mhm.
even do farm labor contractors, that legal designation, does that also apply to people who are only hiring domestic workers or just H2A?
That's a good question. As far as I know, these are firms that hire for the H-2A program. I could be wrong about that. And I do wish that I had some state specific resources for folks when we give this presentation. I always want to be able to plug you in, but I'm just going to have to direct you to farmers that work, that you work around, if they've used the H-2A program, how they are accessing workers, what resources they're using, those industry associations, or, other ag service providers that may have some contacts. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have any good direction to send you for state specific information on that.
No problem. And the farm labor contractors, you mostly say that those are that legal designation of farm labor contractor is really only for H2A, or is it also domestic workers that are contracted through these entities?
Yeah, I am only familiar with it for the H-2A program. Rachel, I don't know if you're familiar with farm labor contractors that also do domestic hiring, or if there is, any sort of legal designation that we keep them separate.
No.
But in my experience, it's just for H-2A.
There are some farm labor contractors that will provide you with non-H2A labor. I'm not going to call it domestic. I'm not sure, where.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's sort of
for
what I'm
when
wondering.
there's something in demand, there's somebody who will supply most of the time.
Thank
All right. Any other final questions for Chloe while we've got her here? Oh, nice. Thanks, Matt. Posting some resources in the chat.
And
All right.
I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to put it, but like in Massachusetts, the cost of housing is absurd. So it's hard even for the average person. It's getting hard for the average person to find housing, right? So just being observant, I looked at what some of the larger vegetable farms are doing around here, and it almost appears like they put up these things that almost I would call like a contractor office that their H2A workers might be living in. Uh, is that common and acceptable?
Well, I think there's a difference between what's common and what is acceptable.
Yeah.
Housing, substandard housing is one of the biggest problems with the H-2A program.
Yeah.
But the housing that is provided is supposed to meet all federal, state, and local regulations, inspections, and be certified. So it is supposed to meet requirements for any residential housing. So if it is substandard, it is likely not meeting that.
Uh-huh.
And then there may be repercussions for that. Yes, someone is saying that it's common for H2A workers to live in trailers. Mobile homes are very common, and it's again going to depend on the local regulations as to what will actually meet those local requirements.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, and then I had one other, I don't want to take up too much time, but do you find it in the labor chart that you showed, there's a big difference between somebody who might apply for a job in North Carolina and then the same labor pool basically could get paid 50% more if they found a position in California. So do you think that it's harder in some states to find these workers, or is there such a pool of workers that you could fill it even in a lower paying state?
I know many farmers in North Carolina who are successfully using the H-2A program. So I don't think it's hurting too much. There's a lot of opportunity here. We have a huge sweet potato industry, and even some small farms that I am familiar with who live, are my neighbors. They are using the H2A program to great success. And the small farms I've talked to are choosing not to lower their wages, even though the AEWRs are decreasing. They've worked with certain farmers for years now, and they're not going to, it would just be bad for the relationship for them to suddenly dock their wages a lot. So, yeah, we have to kind of wait and see what's really going to happen with those lower wages. But yes, it is still possible to get workers, even in the lower paying states. It's still likely a lot higher than they would get paid in their home countries.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Great questions, everybody. And thank you again, Chloe. Excellent presentation. Thanks for making it so organized and for answering our questions. So good to have you here.
Thank you, Ben.
Now, I want to hand it over to Rachel Armstrong. Thank you, Rachel, for making the time. Rachel's the founder and executive director over at Farm Commons. And Rachel, I've just benefited so much from all your resources and workshops and everything. So I'm really grateful for your work, and thank you for making the time to join us tonight.
Yeah, happy to be with you. All right, folks. I'm going to put up a different slideshow presentation. Chloe and I work together on a lot of employment law issues. So if you still have questions on H-2A, you can keep those coming as well. But I'm going to broaden us into some other areas of employment law also. Now, let's see here. Chloe already told you about Farm Commons, so leave that up for a moment, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm joining you from Duluth, Minnesota. This is where I live, and actually where my family has lived for 6 generations now. We kind of got off the boat from Norway and headed right over to grow some potatoes and cabbage here in the cut over lands after the logging companies went through. So farming has been, a bit of a family history for a long time, and I founded Farm Commons because I realized that we needed legal information, and wasn't seeing a lot of that, and I figured, gosh, how hard could it be? I'll go to law school and figure this out myself. So that's kind of the genesis story, and here we are 13 years later, and I have amazing help from Chloe and other staff, and we're able to reach farmers around the country. Now, in our time for the next hour, we are going to talk about two main chunks of employment law. First, we'll go through classifications. What type of worker do you have? We got to talk about that because what type of worker you have determines the laws you got to follow. So then we'll be talking about what are those employment law obligations. We'll be focusing on minimum wage, overtime, and workers' compensation. By no means are those the only employment law obligations. Feel free to ask about the others. There are, many more like non-discrimination and rest and break periods and things like that. I may have information on them. I'll admit my memory isn't so good, as I get older, and I got 3 young kids that sap most of my brain cells. But feel free to ask, and if I don't know offhand, I can probably get you to a resource that's gonna help you move forward. All right. Because brain cells are scarce for many of us, I like to break it down into some really simple points that we can all move forward from. So here's what I need you to walk away knowing from today's first half of the presentation. Almost everyone who does work on a farm is an employee. This means that farms that treat workers as something other than employees, with all the legal obligations that come with employees, are exposed to risk. Maybe that's okay. Risk isn't always bad. But I want you to know that the law is very clear and applies to most farms this way, that almost everyone who does work is going to be an employee. Some of them aren't. There are a few that are not. And if a worker is not an employee, the most common other classification is independent contractors. So that's actually where I'm going to start. Let's talk about independent contractors. They're not employees. So this is the general criteria for an independent contractor. They are someone who brings their own tools and sets their own schedule. They control how a task is accomplished. Like the employer doesn't have a right to give them instructions about how to do it. Right now, that might not make sense. So I'm going to bring in an example. A plumber. Plumber is a classic example of an independent contractor. If you've got some drains that are clogged in your pack shed and you need some help with that, you call the plumber. When they come with a van full of their own tools. They don't pull up and start asking you for the pipe wrench and, some pipe tape and all that good stuff. Also, when you call them, they come when they're able to come. They determine when they're going to come and help you with your plumbing. And while they're doing that, you don't sit there hanging over their shoulder saying, is that really the tool you're going to use? You think you're going to do it that way, huh? I think you should, we let the plumber do their thing. We don't have a right to tell them how to do their job. The plumber also earns a profit or suffers a loss based on project revenue minus expenses. They say they're going to come out, they say that thing's going to cost you $500. If they're efficient, and if their input and equipment costs aren't too high, they'll hopefully make a profit. But as we know as small business people, sometimes the project gets out of hand and they might end up losing money on it. The contrast here is the individual, the farmhand, that gets paid by the hour. You're getting paid by the hour, you're not earning a profit. I mean, yeah, you're getting paid, and you're certainly not experiencing the risk of loss. The last one is that the independent contractor generally provides the same services to others. When the plumber is done at your farm, they will go to someone else's and do the same thing there. So keep in mind that these are general criteria. Not only do individual states have more specific or different criteria, even within a state, different agencies can have different specific criteria. But these are very strong generalities. So let's run this through a scenario. Let's say we've got Farmer May, and she has a row crop operation. In the fall, she works with a neighbor to harvest her crop. The neighbor's got the combine, and the neighbor does custom harvest for a few other farms in the region. The person coordinates the schedule as they're able, and May gives them cash in return. She pays this person by the acre. Does this person meet the criteria? Well, probably yes, for custom farming, as it's called here in the Midwest anyways. They have their combine. It's theirs. They set their own schedule as to whose farm they're going to service at what time. May does not climb in the cab and tell them how to drive the combine or how to repair it or, keep it maintained. And that person makes money if they're efficient and their equipment doesn't break and other things like that. So that's a good scenario where we really have an independent contractor. Construction and repair are our other common scenarios, like the plumbing I mentioned, someone who's going to build you a shed, that sort of thing. However, a lot of the other things we need done on the farm, the cows milked, the spinach beds weeded, are not going to work very well for an independent contractor status. It's unlikely that a farm is really going to have a worker bring their own tools and do things their own way. Farmers usually want it done the way they want it. And rare are these roving service providers who, weed all the spinach beds in the region. I have not seen that happen. So this is definitely an option, and farmers do use independent contractors, but it's unlikely to make up the bulk of the work that the farm needs done. However, if you think you do meet these criteria, be sure to do some additional research. Like I said, these are generalities, so you're going to need to call the different departments in your state agencies, like Department of Revenue and Wage and Hour, and ask them for the specific independent contractor criteria that they require. Like some of them will require that an independent contractor carry their own insurance. And so then you have to ask this person, can I see your proof of insurance? That sort of thing. So I highly recommend additional research to make sure you are resilient if you choose to use this classification. But let's get back to Farmer May with her custom harvest scenario. She has an independent contractor. But what does that mean? Well, it means that she doesn't have to worry about employment laws. Pretty awesome. It's easier. It's like when you pay the plumber for fixing, your broken pipes, you don't worry about whether you've complied with employment laws because the plumber isn't your employee. You just pay them the rate and you go your way. On an accounting note, if you pay an independent contractor $600 or more, you give them a Form 1099 at the end of the year that describes, lists out exactly how much you did pay them. And that's usually the last of your duties. So this can be a good deal. And I'll admit, because it's a good deal and it's easy and the paperwork is light, there's a lot of motivation to use it. A lot of people want independent contractors. And I'm interested in your experience. So, have you worked as an independent contractor? Did these criteria match your situation? Have you heard of others that were hired as independent contractors? Friends, relatives? Did these criteria apply? What have you experienced in your life? Oh, and thanks for the nice note in the chat box. If anyone else wants to get in there and say, what's your experience been with independent contractors? I'm interested. Now, chat box or not, usually folks have different experiences. Okay, yeah, we're getting some comments rolling in. Someone said they did work for a university that did not match the criteria. Others have as like freelance editing. Yep. Okay. Social media content. Yep. Cool. So yes, some people have worked as an independent contractor. We have at least one person who didn't meet the criteria. And that brings up a really good question. Why? If these are the rules, why do we know people that aren't following them? Well, like a lot of things, some of this comes down to enforcement. You've heard the line, a law is as good as its enforcement. So we've got to look at how do these rules get enforced? Usually what happens with independent contractors is that this person is let go from their job, laid off, fired. And sometimes then they go file for unemployment insurance, especially if they are laid off and feel they may be entitled to it. As part of filing that person's claim, the unemployment insurance division in that state starts asking questions like, how long did you work there? What did you do? How were you paid? Very often, that office, that agency, is trying to figure out if the individual was an employee or an independent contractor. And that is a common way for a farm to end up under investigation for their practices. Is the unemployment insurance division is starting to ask questions because some people are trying to make some claims. Less commonly, the worker themselves may file a complaint with the IRS or with the agency that they were misclassified. That sometimes can happen after the worker goes to file their income taxes and then discovers that because they were a contract worker, no income tax was ever withheld, and now they're stuck with paying the entirety of their income tax at once, which of course can amount to thousands of dollars. That can upset workers, and then they file a complaint. So that's often how things start to go bad for a farm that is misclassifying folks. Of course, you can get ahead of that and start to revise how you're classifying folks if you're in that situation before things kind of go bad. Okay. So I roughly defined for you what an independent contractor is, but I never told you what an employee is. So let's move on to that. So the law says that to employ someone is to permit someone to do the work of one's for-profit business. So it's interesting, right? It does not say that to employ someone is to put out a job application, do interviews, select someone, and then train them. No, it just says if you permit someone to do the work of your for-profit business, then you have employed them. So this also can strike us as a little odd, but wait, do we not know people who have worked for-profit businesses that weren't employees and weren't independent contractors? Sometimes, yeah. What you might be thinking of is interns, volunteers. Let's look at those. Okay, we're starting with interns. For a worker to be legally classified as an intern, they need to meet certain criteria. If you want to Google a little something called Fact Sheet 71, you can see the government's latest interpretation of these criteria and how they are assessed. But I'll make it easier on you for right now. I'm just going to share with you three of the most challenging elements of the criteria list. Number one, the intern should be involved in a formal educational program. Formal doesn't have to mean high school or college. Formal can mean a structured program that has a curriculum and that has an assessment to measure achievement of certain milestones. So it's got to have that minimum where there are things we're teaching and we're measuring whether or not those things are achieved. The second one I have listed here is that the intern receives significant and broadly applicable educational benefit. So that means they shouldn't just be learning how to trellis tomatoes on your farm. They should be learning why we trellis tomatoes, different approaches to trellising tomatoes, why you have chosen the tomato trellis technique that you use, and how other farms might make different choices. That is a significant and broadly applicable educational benefit, as compared to, I need you to pound in these tea stakes, and then we do some basket weaving with twine. That's it. So the third one is perhaps the most challenging, though. The intern cannot displace current employees. Well, displacement is easy to see if, like, you go out and fire all your workers and then hire interns. Definitely that you have committed displacement, and that's going to be a problem. But that's really not how it happens. You got to ask yourself a broader question. Pretend that the intern doesn't show up for work that day. Is that okay? Is it okay because their task wasn't very important anyways, and you can just fit it in yourself? Or maybe you won't do it at all? Or do you have to find someone else to get that job done? And if they consistently don't show up, are you going to have to hire someone to get that job done? If you need someone to do the job, the intern has likely displaced a current employee. So that can feel really awkward. Like, look, if I don't actually need them to show up, why do I even have an intern? That's the point. That is the point of what the law is getting at here. This person needs to be so unimportant and maybe even unhelpful to your farm that they are not an employee. Because you remember the definition of to employ someone is to permit someone to do the work of your for-profit business. This person, you got to be wasting some time, testing them, teaching them broadly applicable things, not really using their labor to get ahead. So if these criteria are not met, You can call them whatever you want, but they're an employee, and employment laws need to be followed. If this is looking like a situation you might have, again, I urge you to do some further research. I only went into detail on the three ones that I consider most fatal to farm internships, but also do a little state research to see if your state has a different interpretation of these rules. So sometimes when I talk to farmers, they say at this point, well, shucks, I'm not going to do the intern thing, but what about volunteers? I've heard about farms that have volunteers. Many of us may have volunteered on farms and enjoyed our time there. Well, the law is quite straightforward on this point. For-profit businesses are not eligible to have volunteers. If you remember, our definition of to employ someone, it is to permit someone to do the work of a for-profit farm. So that is why volunteers are not possible. Volunteers exist, yes, but they are people who give their time to charitable, nonprofit organizations or government in order to benefit humanity. That's the federal definition within various employment laws. So whether an individual is a stranger, your relative, a friend, I can't say it enough. If they're doing the work of a for-profit business, they're within the definition of employed. And employment laws apply. So I've got some examples for you. Farmer January. She's got a CSA program. Some of her customers would rather help out on the farm. They want to pack boxes on delivery day. They'd like to do some social media marketing rather than pay cash for their shares. Farmer January loves the help, and she sets up a program where people can earn their CSA share through labor, things she needs done around the farm. How are these folks going to be treated under the law? Well, we got to go back to that question. Anyone who is permitted to do the work of a for-profit business is employed. So in this case, these folks, packing boxes is kind of the work of a CSA farm. I mean, you could be one of those free choice CSAs where you're setting out crates, but then, picking the product and setting it out is the work of the farm. Doing marketing is usually the work of the farm. If they don't market, no sales. It's possible that they could be construed as independent contractors if they meet those criteria. They're bringing their own tools and setting their own schedule and deciding how that job is done. That might work for the marketing. We had someone in the chat box who did social media marketing as an independent contractor, so that does happen. However, packing boxes, it's not really going to work for that scenario. So in this case, Farmer January's helpers are likely employees, and she needs to consider her employment law obligations to them. We got a question in the chat box. What are the rules around something like a work share program, where customers are working a certain number of hours and then receiving a share of the produce? The rules are, as I'm saying here, if they're doing the work of a for-profit farm, the first stop is that they're employees. Our other option could be independent contractors if they're meeting those criteria. But for the most part, that's not what I see in a work share program. I see employment. Now, I do still see farms that are running a worker share program and treating those folks like employees. They are providing at least the minimum wage. They are paying attention to those other employment laws. So it doesn't mean that the program has to go away. It means we need to look at our obligations and see about following them. I got another example, Farmer August. He's got a dairy operation, and his brother used to work with him, but recently left for a different career. August finds he needs some help, and so he talks with his brother, and they arrange for August's nephew to come over after school to help out for a few hours every day. How do we classify his nephew? If you're guessing employee, you're probably right. He's doing the work of a for-profit dairy farm. It's not relevant that he's his nephew. Now, some elements of employment law might exempt relatives, but that's usually only your children and your parents. I have not seen a state that exempts nephews, aunts, or uncles from employment law. All right. So a couple more questions. What about sporadic volunteer days, farm experience days? Oh, good question. Good question. We got to go back to that to what to my definition of to employ someone, to permit someone to do the work of a for-profit operation. So what are we doing here on these sporadic volunteer days? Are we doing the work of a for-profit farm? Then we have employees. And I have two examples coming up of well, I don't want to spoil it. We're going to get to them. It'll help illustrate that though. Okay, someone else says, what are the rules for the same for a CSA workshare if the farm is a certified nonprofit? Rules are different for a nonprofit. What I've been talking about is for-profit operations. Nonprofits can have volunteers. Like I said before, volunteers are those who are giving their time to charitable, nonprofit, governmental organizations. Now, you know, we can't go crazy. There are still rules for nonprofits and utilizing volunteers, but they're quite different. We do have a guide on that if, you know, folks are interested in the rules for nonprofits. And I got a couple more examples here. We got Farmer July. She has a U-Pick farm, raspberries. It's organized as an LLC. Folks come to pick their own raspberries. And she's attending today's program and she's like, oh my goodness, where does it end? Where does it end? Are these people who are picking the raspberries my employees? Now all of a sudden I'm supposed to be paying them minimum wage? What do you think? Is Farmer July permitting them to do the work of her for-profit business? I'm going to propose to you that the work of a raspberry U-Pick farm is to grow raspberries, provide containers for people to pick them into, tell them how to pick the berries, weigh the berries they pick, take their money, give them some recipes, provide a couple of photo ops, you know? That's the work of a for-profit U-Pick farm. Picking raspberries is not the work of a for-profit U-Pick farm. If nobody comes to pick raspberries, we just have a failing U-Pick. So there's a limit. We don't have to become too sad about these rules. Just ask ourselves, what is the work of this for-profit enterprise? Some other things, examples of things that I would say are probably not the work of a for-profit farm are things like planting pollinator habitat, doing ecological restoration, doing authentic gleaning that is, taking unmarketable product out of the field, folks, stuff the farmer wasn't going to harvest anyways. Those things, not the work of that for-profit business. Okay. So, to touch back on that question about sporadic volunteer days, farm experience days, we really got to dig into what exactly are we doing here? And is it the farm's work? Now, most farmers only want to go through the burdens and the trials and tribulations of a volunteer day if they're going to get work done. They're not just like out there offering recreation. They want it to be fun, but, they still want that 1 acre of garlic planted. So, the limitation on getting actual work done does dissuade a lot of people from hosting sporadic volunteer or farm experience days. Okay, so what do we do now? If we have an employee, then we need to understand our employment law obligations. Oh, and I see another question there. As you'll notice, I like to take questions as we go because I don't want to, leave you hanging and then run on to another point. It does mean I tend to have less time at the end for questions, so, get them in. Are owner-operators who work on their farm considered employees? Yes, a lot of times they are. Now, that's a whole nother subject, but it's usually because they have chosen to file their taxes as an S corporation. And in that case, yes, owner-operators are employees. And yes, employment laws apply. But let me tell you, when you examine minimum wage law, it says it doesn't apply to yourself. It says it does not apply to owners. Same with unemployment insurance. It it applies to employees, but except not the owner-operator employee. Overtime. Yes, it applies to employees, but not the owner-operator. So, the law says over and over, but not the owners. And that's what you got to look for. Is there an exception? It'll often usually say, but not your own children, but not your spouse. But that's usually where it stops. You, your children, and your spouse. Okay, so let's talk about minimum wage, overtime, and workers' comp. I'll sneak in unemployment insurance if I have a chance, but I think I deleted that slide at a time. Okay, minimum wage. Do you have to pay at least the minimum wage? Well, the surprising answer is that some farms do, and some farms don't. It depends on the state you're located in and on your farm size. Now, honestly, this question is often moot because in order to attract a qualified workforce or any workforce, most farms need to offer well above the minimum wage. In some states, the minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, and most farms are not paying that little. So, I'll say a lot of farms don't bother with whether or not they have to pay at least the minimum wage. They already are. We're usually paying attention to this issue if we're actually talking about an internship or a volunteer program. As you learned, most internships and volunteer arrangements are actually employment. And so then we ask this question, do we owe the intern or the volunteer at least the minimum wage? Sometimes we don't. No. The farm might be too small in a state that provides an exception. So it becomes easier to have the intern who is actually an employee, the volunteer who is actually an employee, because you don't have to pay minimum wage still. So here are some examples. Washington State. Well, they're a great example of one where there is a minimum wage and it's high. You got to pay at least $17.13 per hour in all cases. Well, let's say you're in Illinois. No minimum wage until the farm has about 6 to 7 full-time employees doing farm labor. That's a little something called the federal 500 man-day rule, and it is also very commonly the case in many of our southern states. So a farm in Illinois can get quite large before it has to think about minimum wage. Montana, I use this example because they use a different threshold for when a farm owes minimum wage. They say if the gross annual sales are about 110,000 or less and a product is sold entirely in Montana, minimum wage could be as low as $4 an hour for agricultural labor. If the farm exceeds those, revenue thresholds or sells out of state, then the minimum wage goes up to $10.85 an hour. So the bottom line is if you are not paying at least the minimum wage to all workers, you got to look it up. If you know you're not already doing that, look it up. Farm Commons does have details for every state in our union as to what their minimum wage is right now for agricultural labor. Okay, let's talk overtime. In most states, overtime is not owed unless you assign non-agricultural labor. If you assign non-agricultural labor, then you owe overtime, which is 1.5 times their regular wage for all hours worked over 40 in that week. So let's say that you've got a Monday to Friday work week. And on Tuesday, you ask your employee to help you out with this new value-added product you're working on. You're making some jam out of your raspberries. Maybe you have a U pick and not enough people came to U pick. So you went out, you picked the raspberries, you're going to make some jam. Making jam is not agricultural labor. So on Tuesday, they spend 3 hours helping you with a batch of jam. The rest of the week, they go back to their farm labor, and by Friday afternoon, they put in 50 hours. That farm owes overtime on 10 of those hours. Non-agricultural labor was committed in that week, and it went over 40. So this is most states. Most states are going to follow that rule, which is federal. And some states are different. So I am going to get to what's agricultural labor, but before we get there, I want to raise a flag for anyone who is in these states listed. If you're in California or Washington, your state does require overtime for farmers at 40 hours a week or more. In Colorado, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, and Minnesota, overtime is required in some circumstances. So it could be more than 40. It could be like a threshold of 50 hours a week. It's more variable, could depend on size. So for the most part, farms are worried about whether or not they're committing non-agricultural labor. So let's explore that a little bit more. Non-agricultural labor includes agritourism. If they're setting up for a wedding on the farm, if they are giving classroom tours, that sort of thing. If we're offering zucchini festival and, selling tickets to the pumpkin launching machine. Food service, food truck festivals, dinner on the farm. Handling products not grown on the farm. That could include things like selling a coffee share and packing coffee or bread into the CSA. Work that is exclusively in a packing shed can be non-agricultural. So if you have a worker that never goes out into the field, doesn't plant, doesn't weed, all they do is trim and pack produce, that can be non-agricultural. Making deliveries and taking orders to restaurants also. One second, just a moment. Sorry about that. I have 3 kids. We baked a cake and they urgently need to know if it is done and they can take it out of the oven. So it's probably done. All right, where was I? Oh yeah, making deliveries, taking orders to restaurants, value-added processing, like I mentioned before, doing product development, exploring new ventures for the farm, non-agricultural. So that's what we really got to watch out for when it comes to overtime, since most of us are in states where we're not going to have to pay it right at 40 hours a week. Okay. So I covered minimum wage, overtime. Now we've got workers' compensation. You got to ask yourself, okay, now that I know I've got employees, do I need to buy workers' comp? It really depends on the state that you're in. And again, we've got this listed out for every state at our website. And this is a sampler of the variation you might find. In Indiana, no farms have to buy workers' compensation. In Illinois, farms have to buy workers' compensation when they exceed 400 working days in any calendar quarter. Oh my goodness, what's a working day? Earlier, you heard me refer to man day, and Illinois does have the good grace to at least call them working days, but they are based on the same kind of calculation. A working day is any day, any time in which one person shows up to work for at least 1 hour. So if 4 people come to work for 1 hour, you've got 4 working days. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes these things can be complicated. You got to keep some serious math going. In Iowa, you've got to buy when payroll reaches $2,500. Michigan, 3 full-time employees. Montana, you just got to buy it all the time. So you never quite know what you're going to get with workers' comp. It's really important to know, though, and to take that step if you have to, because the penalties can be pretty serious for not providing workers' compensation when you're supposed to. It's a great example of where the state's going to try to punish you. You know, a lot of times with things like overtime, they'll say, back wages. Well, now you have to pay overtime. But workers' compensation is a bit more punitive, where they, want to punish you for flouting this law. So I've seen things like $1,000 a day as a fine for not carrying workers' compensation when you're supposed to. Last thing I want to say about workers' comp is if you are in a state where workers' compensation is not required, keep in mind you are exposed to a lawsuit from all workers who are injured on your farm. Any employee that gets hurt can sue you for that because you provided the wrong tools, you didn't train them well enough, you negligently hired someone who, ignored all the rules, whatever it is. I highly recommend you get insurance to cover that liability. It may or may not be cheaper than workers' compensation. So sometimes folks don't have to buy workers' comp, but they choose to because it can be a simpler, easier system than waiting to get sued and then having to defend yourself in court, which can be really unfun. All right. So it's always my goal to have a good 10 minutes left for questions. So we are going to yep, I covered all my questions. I'm sorry, I covered all of my slides. We've got a ton more information at our website. Like I mentioned, we've got info on all 50 states that goes into detail on so many of these specifics. If you're sitting around thinking, gosh, I need to know even more, we've got a 6-hour advanced farm employment law course. You could learn so much more. So we've got a Q&A platform, all that good stuff. But you also have me for 10 more minutes, and I would love to take some questions.
Amazing, Rachel. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Looks like Lorian's asking, what do you have to do to submit W-2s?
Okay. Great. So everybody who employs someone needs to give them a W-2 at the end of the year, by the end of January usually. So in order to do that, first you needed to have given them and then received back a W-4. The W-4 gives you the vital information that you need to start withholding their income tax and remitting that to the state and federal government on their behalf. So you use the W-4 to begin doing that process, and then you keep records throughout the year of how much you've paid them, how much you sent on their behalf to the state and the federal government, and then that is what you use to create the W-2. So the W-2 lists all that out, and then they use that to pay their taxes. So to answer the question, what do you have to do to submit that? You needed to have collected that paperwork and have maintained the appropriate documentation throughout the time they were hired. Honestly, most folks are going to use a payroll service. I know I do. For Farm Commons, I hired myself and I tried to do all this work myself and I did it wrong, honestly. And eventually I was like, never mind, I'm going to pay a payroll service for this. And then they do it for you. And it is so much easier. Okay, I see. What if the farm is cooperatively owned and operated under a cooperative legal status? So generally speaking, all the workers in a cooperative are employees. There may be some different arrangements that you can find, but for the most part, they're all employees and employment laws all apply to that. Someone else says, so I want to set up employees. What do I do? Um, the easiest way is to use a payroll service. They will tell you what to do. Like, hey, this is the W-4. Have them fill this out. They will calculate, withhold, and remit the taxes on your behalf. You still have to pay attention and answer their questions and, open the tax accounts and things like that, but they make it much easier. If you don't do that, if you want to do it yourself, you do have a lot of learning to do. Um, you I recommend going to like the Small Business Development Center and asking them what to do to set up for taxes and payment in your state. It's 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 a long process. I mean, you can definitely do it. I did it myself for a year, but I also got fined and did it wrong and then decided not to. Okay. Oh, great. Another comment. Most states have an online calculator to help you figure out payroll taxes. Those are wonderful resources to use when you're trying to figure out the actual costs of employing somebody. Be careful not to make the mistake and assume the only thing you're going to pay is the wage. You say, oh, I'm going to pay $12 an hour, so, you know, 12 times 8, that's what I owe them in a day. No, you owe more because of payroll taxes, because of insurance, and using some of these online calculators can help you get a better estimate of the real costs of employing. University of Vermont Extension also has some cool resources for farmers on determining the costs of hiring, and it's a nice system. You can plunk in how many workers you've got and take it from there. Do we have to withhold taxes in every, I'm trying to read this one, in every case? How much does an employee have to work before you have them complete a W-4 and then withhold taxes? Okay, I'm gonna shoot from the hip a little bit on this one. I don't think I'm gonna be too far off. The threshold is very low before you need to have a W-4 and then start withholding taxes. It's something like as soon as you pay them $150 to an individual, or the total you've paid to your entire payroll is like 2,500. And I would Google that just to be sure because I didn't prepare that for the presentation today. But that has been the threshold in the past as soon as you cross that line. So it's pretty quick. And that total payroll of 2,500 includes like yourself. If you've paid yourself more than that, then you need to do this process immediately for everyone that you hire before you pay them anything. Okay, does a workers' comp policy cover liability for interns, volunteers, worker shares in the situation where it's appropriate to have them? Yes, yes. And this was surprising to me when I learned it. Yeah, you can go to your workers' comp provider and say, look, I've got two like W-2 employees. I've got two regular full-time employees, but I've got a set of 15 interns. I've got 20 volunteers who come on Friday, and I want to cover them under the workers' comp policy. Now, their brain might explode because they've never heard of a volunteer and on a farm before. But yes, they can usually be covered under workers' comp. Now, the workers' comp agent is going to say to you, we don't cover volunteers. But now you know in your mind, that's just the title you're using. They're not volunteers. They are employees. You just call them volunteers. So no, you can't go to a workers' comp agent and say, I want to cover my volunteers. You got to say, I got to cover these 15 employees who show up on Fridays. And let me tell you, it's really odd. You might not have seen this before. I pay them in vegetables. They're cool with it. I'm paying at least the minimum wage. It's just in vegetables. You have to really like walk them through this. And they're going to say, how much are those vegetables worth? Well, $600, you You kind of got to walk them through it. But there are absolutely farms that have purchased workers' comp on their worker share programs, on their worker shares. Ooh, awesome. We've got a link to Payroll 101. Love it. Oh, and the employee cost estimator. Great crew on the program today.
Anyone have any final questions for Rachel while we've got her? This is a good opportunity to get your. Okay, here we go.
Does this still apply for for-profit businesses? Oh, yes. Most everything that we have talked about today applies to for-profit businesses. Really, the distinction is if you have a nonprofit, you are allowed to have volunteers. And that's going to change things. There are limits. And since I've, got a little bit of time and not another question, I can give you a little bit of the context there. If you're a nonprofit, where's the line in having volunteers? The line is if your volunteers are dependent on you for baseline human needs like housing and food. If your volunteers are dependent on you for that, it can cross the line into employment. So, the classic example, this was a US Supreme Court case. It's from the 80s, I think. We had there was a well-meaning nonprofit that helped folks rehabilitate, after experiencing substance abuse problems in their lives. They provided housing, they provided work to be done, they provided food. These folks also worked in thrift stores. And the US Supreme Court said, okay, they might be volunteers, but they are dependent on you for their housing, for their food, and for the way that they like their sustenance in life. Therefore, they are employees, and you need to follow employment laws. You need to give them at least the minimum wage, overtime, that sort of thing. So that's just an example of the limit, even if you're a nonprofit. Okay, what is the cost and what are the benefits from joining Farm Commons as a farming organization? What types of assistance and resources are offered? The primary benefit if you're a farmer is that you get access to all of our online courses. So if you want to take that 6-hour course on farm employment law and you want, the videos and the guides that go with it, that's the main thing you're going to get. If you're an institution, then you get, a lot more stuff, but that's really why farmers join. Other farmers say, well, I don't really want the online courses. A lot of the guides I want are already free. And so, they're not motivated to join. You might be asking if you get like legal services. No, we don't do legal services for farmers by and large. Okay, what if someone requests to be paid through their business entity? Okay, usually in that case, they're an independent contractor and they want you to, pay their LLC because it helps them, with their books for their business. So that's usually what's going on there. If they're an employee, you can't really pay them through their business entity. So I hope I'm understanding your question correctly there. If you're taking on an independent contractor, you're collecting a W-9, not a W-4. You're collecting a W-9, and the W-9 says, the important information to help you prepare your 1099 at the end. Oh, so follow up. They work on the farm and they're requesting to be paid through their business entity. I do not know why that is happening.
All right. I think we should be respectful of Rachel's time. I know you've got a cake to get to. So, Rachel, thank you so much for joining, sharing all these insights, making these resources available to folks. It's invaluable. And yeah, thanks for helping us navigate these waters that can be a little tricky. So, really appreciate you joining and keep up the good work there. And
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
thanks. And thank you all for your great questions, for participating. I just want to remind you a quick poll will pop up when you log out. So it really helps us out if you can fill that out. Rachel, you're getting lots of love in the chat, by the way.
Thanks,
Um,
everyone.
but but yeah, thanks everyone. I hope our paths cross again. We'll have part 6 in about a month. And please reach out if there's anything New Entry can do to help you in your farming endeavors. And have a great night. Take care.